Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. My goal is what we've discussed today will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear your comments for this episode about what you're planning on implementing. Today, I'm very excited to be joined with Rebecca Zucker, who coaches C-level executives and other senior level leaders across the globe. In addition to her several venture-backed up startups, her clients span multiple sectors, including technology, venture capital, private equity, financial services, media, healthcare, and much more. She is a regular contributor to the Harvard Business Review and Forbes.com and is frequently quoted in the press on career and leadership issues. Thank you for joining me today, Rebecca.
Thank you for having me.
I love this area that we're going to focus on today because I think it's very relevant to the leaders at all levels. And that's the feeling of being overwhelmed at work and burnout resulting in that, which is a huge pain point for so many leaders today. But before we dive into that topic, I always like to get from you a little background for our listeners. And I'd love to know how that journey entailed from Goldman Sachs, being an investment banker there, to having a leadership position at Disney, and now in your current role as a founding partner of Next Step Partners.
I would say the common thread throughout my entire career is that I have always been passionate about the people side of business and supporting others to be successful. That's what really lights me up and excites me about my work. And in particular, helping people change the trajectory of their careers and their lives is especially meaningful for me. And so even when I was in investment banking, I was always at the front of the line, raising my hand to do things like recruiting, training, coaching, mentoring, and things like that. And then I left investment banking to really fulfill a lifelong dream of living and working in France. I'm a huge Francophile, so that was always a dream of mine, and made that happen. And having a global experience was really amazing, just to be exposed in great depth to another culture, and not just the French culture since I worked in Paris, but it was really a multicultural role since I worked with 22 countries throughout Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And then came back to the States and went back to banking in a learning and development capacity, running that function for a regional investment bank based in San Francisco before starting Next Step Partners.
And give us some more insight into Next Step Partners.
Sure. So we are a global leadership development firm, and we have about 50 coaches across the US as well as Europe and Asia, working with senior leaders in really all functions and sectors, helping them to expand their leadership capacity. And that is typically working from the inside out.
That's great. And we'll unpack more of that toward the end of our episode, but I'd love to jump in now to this overwhelmed at work. And this impact can take many forms, right? Such as brain fog, forgetfulness, confusion, the inability to concentrate, your mind is racing, and the list could go on. And this really stems from what I consider to be they're having too many demands on an individual's time and trying to get everything done. What I've seen is people are more distractible. Do you see this effect happening and getting worse, or have you seen something different?
I do think it's been exacerbated with the pandemic. I wrote my article for HBR, How to Deal with Feeling Constantly Overwhelmed, before the pandemic. So it was an issue well before the pandemic. And as you mentioned, there are many effects of overwhelm. There's emotional, cognitive, and physical effects. And I think it's really a question of our capacity on each of those levels: emotional, cognitive, and physical capacity. And the pandemic has really served to take up a lot of room. If you think of that capacity, if you think about our capacity as a bucket and the various things that are filling that bucket, how much room is left to deal with the things that we have to deal with, whether it's work or elsewhere, but also the uncertainty that arose in business and in world events as a result of that. So that certainly took up a lot of capacity that left little extra room to deal with the things that we have to deal with. And I would say it's very multifaceted. depending on an individual situation. So all of a sudden, people were homeschooling their children, or they had to share a workspace with a spouse or a roommate, or maybe they didn't have a really good workspace at home. So there's so many different variables that affected our capacity that would have somebody get overwhelmed much more easily. But one thing that I want to highlight is that, as I mentioned, the work that my colleagues and I do is from the inside out. There is no question that the tidal wave of things coming at us, both work related, certainly pandemic related, throw in, racial injustices happening, that can really re-traumatize people. So external variables uh, are definitely one thing or one subset of variables that can have us become more overwhelmed. What I'm also researching are the internal variables that can lead people to become more overwhelmed. And that's not to minimize that we need to address the external component. We need to address the cultural components that have people just work more and more and more. That's not to minimize that. But I have various hypotheses that I am testing and awaiting the results of the analysis of the data, which I hope to share as that becomes available. But that overwhelm is inherently an inner experience. So, what are the variables within us that might have somebody be more prone to becoming overwhelmed, that might also take up our capacity and make us less able to handle that tidal wave of things coming at us? And those variables span a whole host of things that I'm looking at.
Well, no, I'd love for you to unpack a few of those variables for us because I love to hear those. But you're right, those external factors, a lot of which may be outside of our control, right? So let's focus on those internal factors. And what do you see as maybe one or two of those common ones that make people more prone to being overwhelmed or predispose them to being that way?
Well, one variable that I'm looking at is, adverse childhood experiences. And there's been a lot of research around adverse childhood experiences, or ACE experiences, as people call them. And when somebody is a survivor of, say, trauma, particularly a developmental trauma, where their people who were supposed to care for them and keep them safe did not do so, or even worse, harm them in some way, that can impact not only how they see the world and their subjective sense of safety, but also it impacts their creativity. It impacts their ability to deal with uncertainty, which just, for any of us, uncertainty is viewed as a threat. And so when our threat response is triggered, we are less able to deal with the day-to-day things. So that's one element. There are several other elements like locus of control, or I'm also looking at a stage of adult development, where the higher stage of adult development, the greater we're able to handle complexity. So that's also something that I'm looking at, among a whole host of other factors. Another one that comes to mind is just our perception of power. And, in particular, when you're looking at an employee in an organization, there is a power structure, there's a hierarchy, and we have perceptions of power. And what is our perception about our ability to say no to our boss or push back, our sense of how safe that is to do that? And one of the biggest abuses of power, been highlighted out there, is not using the power we have and assuming that we don't have any. So it's not to discount there are real power structures, but also we have as much power as we give ourselves. So we do have some agency and control. And that's the good news, is that with these internal variables that affect our experience of overwhelm, we do have some agency and control about how much overwhelm we end up feeling, in that we can control the situations, or not just the situations, but we can control how we address those situations, and therefore control more than we think, perhaps, how much overwhelm we end up feeling.
Thank you for providing those factors. And I love unpacking those because all of those are relevant And I know that our listeners will have some value in wanting to hear more as you learn from your research and get those results to see which ones are really affecting everyone the most. Now, moving forward with that to say, okay, we've identified some of those predisposed factors, inherent qualities that you might have that make you more likely to feel overwhelmed. What is some of the steps that we could take ourselves to feel less overwhelmed? Is there a first step that you recommend people taking to say, okay, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. I'm really stressed and anxious. I'm ready for burnout. I don't even know where to begin. What would be that first step for them to start down that road to feel less overwhelmed?
Great question. I distinguish the strategies for dealing with overwhelm in two main groups. One is preventative strategies, things that we can do ahead of time so that we don't find ourselves overwhelmed. And then there's more in the moment strategies when you do feel yourself sort of underneath that tidal wave that's coming over your head and you start panicking or getting that feeling of overwhelm. How do you handle it in the moment? Starting with preventative strategies, I think there are a number of things that people can do. Setting clear boundaries and keeping those boundaries. And I think it's that latter piece. My clients, I find, have a greater challenge with. It's not so much setting them, a lot of times it's around keeping them. And I'll get back to that in a moment. But other things are just setting realistic expectations from the beginning with key stakeholders, whether that's your boss, whether it's peers in your organization or other people that you're dealing with. Also challenging our own perfectionism. And there are two types of perfectionism. One is about high standards. The other type is more self-critical in nature, that nothing we do is good enough. So that provides some nuance as well in how we challenge perfectionism, but also outsourcing and delegating, whether that's delegating at home or delegating at work or both, can be helpful. Also, time boxing, single tasking, when we're trying to do so much at once, that can create the overwhelm and actually makes us less productive. So it's sort of a double whammy in that regard. Breaking down large tasks so that they are more manageable, but that they seem more manageable, because oftentimes it's what it seems that is making us overwhelmed than what it actually is. And that also requires prioritization. So when everything is important, nothing is important. Again, that sort of goes hand in hand with multitasking. And that may involve pushing back when something else gets put on your plate, talking with your boss about, okay, how can we reprioritize things given this new thing that's just come up? And that may require some negotiation and asking for more resources, more time, more people, more money, whatever that might be. But I think a real big one is challenging our own limiting beliefs and assumptions. And this is where it comes back to keeping boundaries or even being able to say no. Oftentimes we have limiting beliefs and assumptions about the dire consequences of what will happen if we say no. It might be a belief that if I say no, my boss will think I'm less committed. Or if I say no, this is where gender or racial stereotypes can come into play. A whole host of limiting beliefs and assumptions can come up. And so really, I would say surfacing them, shining a light on them so we can examine them, and then ultimately debunk them. And there are many ways that we can start to create some experiments to debunk those limiting assumptions. But I would say those are a number of preventative strategies.
Before we move into the at the moment strategies, I'd love to unpack just that because you said a lot there. So just wanted to take two of those and just kind of drill down a little bit deeper, especially around perfectionists, right?
Yes.
Because you're spot on that there's really two types. There's the self-deprecating or self-critical perfectionist that's just always hard on themselves, or the other type that sets impossible standards, which causes procrastination, things to pile up and feeling more overwhelmed. Any tips that you can give for those that are in both categories of perfectionism to help them out and feel less overwhelmed?
Yes. And I think it also ties to challenging the limiting beliefs and assumptions. So, for example, I had a client who this was more the self critical element of it. And it was also an example of black and white thinking that if it's not perfect, it's a failure. Or if it's not perfect, it's mediocre, which to some people is also failure. So, really unpacking that and maybe working with somebody like a coach or even a therapist to break those down and challenge that thinking, because oftentimes it does take somebody else to show you the limited nature of that thinking or to show you other ways of looking at those things that can help expand your thinking and transform your thinking, frankly, because that's what you're going for. I know a big formative experience for me, because I was definitely a perfectionist early in my, I would say in my college days, was graduate school. And where I went to graduate school, there was a wonderful policy that recruiters were not permitted to see grades. So it really eliminated any need to, frankly, excel beyond passing. And how incredibly transformative it was, I would say, both in the respect that it encouraged you to experiment with new things that you might otherwise be too intimidated to take on, for fear that you might not do well in a particular class, but also that the real learning for me was that good was good enough. And they say, perfection is the enemy of the good. And I'm probably getting that expression wrong, but you get the gist. And learning that, yeah, good is good enough. I was an economics major undergrad. And so other way that I look at it is, what is the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost of spending more time to make this perfect? And oftentimes the answer to that is very little, if not negative.
I love thinking at the margin about that and that phrase, good is good enough and done is better than perfect, right? I love how you stated those because I think that really drives that point home, right? And then the other thing that you had mentioned as part of unpacking these preventative strategies is getting better at saying no, because you don't want to be perceived the right way. You don't want to lose opportunities, possibilities for promotion, but many times leaders take on too much. And you have to remember that if you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to a whole host of other things that you're not able to do, but they don't have that mindset. So I think that's so important for us to just really emphasize is the fact that any effective and successful leader in their past has gotten very good at saying no so that they can focus on those critical few things.
Yes. Yes. And there are different ways to say no. You can say, no, not right now, or no, not in this form, or no, not by that date, or no, not with these resources. And again, that goes to the negotiation piece. Or no, I can't do it, but let me refer you to somebody who can.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk now about a few of those at the moment strategies, right? So you can get those preventative ones, but inevitably there's going to be something that happens during the course of a day, a week, certain times of year that just pushes you in that direction. And then you have to have a strategy that's going to work in the moment.
Yes. Well, I think the first thing that's most important is to actually notice that you're feeling overwhelmed, to stop and notice and name it. There is real power in that. And oftentimes, people are on autopilot and they are letting their overwhelm overtake their behavior without realizing that they are in that state. So being really conscious of it. And that in itself can be a learning process. We have to slow down enough to really stop, notice, and name it. And once we're able to do that, we can, take a beat. We can ground ourselves, take a breath. Maybe it's walking around the block or having a drink of water, but taking a moment. And one of the first things that I personally do is really try and hone in on what is the primary source of my overwhelm right now. What one thing, if I took it off my plate, would alleviate 80% of the overwhelm that I'm feeling right now? And that in itself can be immensely helpful, because then you can employ some of the other strategies, whether it's negotiating a deadline extension or more resources or delegating, finding what you need to outsource. I was just interviewing somebody yesterday who had been feeling very overwhelmed, and she loves her work. She takes a lot of joy in her work. So she says yes to everything. And she found herself feeling really overwhelmed. She was going to be facilitating a number of offsites, and she decided to bring in a co-facilitator to help her with the upfront design that took a lot of the work off of her plate and really helped her manage herself and her situation much more effectively. So once we know what that primary source of our overwhelm is, we can then deal with that. I would say another strategy that's helpful in the moment is to reframe it or regain perspective on it. Oftentimes, it's something that feels really big that may not, in the scheme of things, be so big. And a question I like to ask myself is, a month from now, a year from now, how much is this going to matter? And that can help put it in perspective for me. So it might be that question or a different question, but really reframing the situation in some way. And that can be even finding the humor in the situation. That can also be really helpful. But also asking for help is another great strategy. Like I said, whether it's delegation or asking for some type of assistance from somebody. And that can be hard for people who, either pride themselves on being self-sufficient or may view asking for help as some type of weakness. Again, a lot of it is around challenging our own thinking, and that includes how we think about asking for help. I would say finally, practicing self-compassion, that we are all human beings. There is a physical limit to what we are able to do. And feeling overwhelmed is not necessarily a statement about how good or smart you are. We can all find ourselves in that situation. So to give yourself some grace to be able to be more accepting of yourself in those situations.
I think you're absolutely right. And it does need to start with being self-aware, right? That you're experiencing these emotions and then identifying, if you can, that primary source, which is so critical. And in some cases, like you stated, you can't take it off your plate, but maybe you can break it up into more manageable chunks so you feel less overwhelmed moving forward. And that perspective, the reframing is so critical. 10 years, 15 years from now, we're at a 50,000-foot view. Is this really significant in the bigger picture, right? In the bigger scheme of things, which I feel like when people get to being overwhelmed, it's very granular. They blow things out of proportion. This is the entire world for them. And they don't have that right perspective moving forward. And really moving now into that overwhelmed, how can people identify, or what's some of the most common signs that would indicate that you're pushing yourself too hard?
Great question. And before I answer that question, I really want to take a step back and just distinguish between pressure, stress, overwhelm, and burnout. Interrelated, of course, and often used interchangeably, and they're somewhat different from each other. So pressure is all around us every day. We get pressure from our work projects, our bosses, our clients, our colleagues, our families. Stress is what we do with that pressure in our minds. It's how we think about it. And so overwhelm is one type of stress, or work stress in this case. And if it's not managed effectively, it can lead to burnout. So overwhelm is effectively when we are experiencing more than we can process in any given moment. And as we've learned, not only can we as individuals feel overwhelmed, but teams and organizations can feel overwhelmed. Systems like our healthcare system or hospital system can be overwhelmed, and supply chain systems can be overwhelmed. So really understanding those distinctions. And so we can interrupt it at, multiple points in that chain before it escalates too far. But I would say that, to answer your question, what are some of the things that we can do to prevent, overwhelm from turning into burnout, is noticing that things are escalating and to take action to address it. Again, finding what is the biggest driver here, what's the biggest lever that I have. And it may be moving things around on your schedule. It may be delegating. It may be saying no or no, not right now. It really, I think, depends on what the specific situation is. But there are so many things that we can do. I would say a big thing that I see people doing that sort of shoots themselves in the foot, when you are growing as a leader in an organization, it is really all about getting leverage. And what that leverage means is getting leverage from your people, and for those people to get leverage from their people, and so on. And it's about creating not just leadership capacity, but organizational capacity. And so that requires delegating. And that is something that some people are very good at and is more of what we would call a technical skill. It's more sort of the how-to part of things. And there's always the how-to or information-based part of that skill that are important to learn. But for a lot of people, this is what we would call an adaptive challenge. And that is how we think about that activity or challenge of delegating. And there are often fears that get in the way. Like if I delegate, I'm going to get cut out of the loop and become irrelevant. Or if I delegate it, they won't do it as well as me and I'm going to look bad. These are all, self-protective kind of commitments that we hold on to that are kept in place by, again, limiting beliefs and assumptions about what would happen if they didn't do it as well as me and I look bad. What are my perceived dire consequences of that? And so really learning how to let go and to empower other people so that you can elevate yourselves and operate at your highest and best use. And that can help you keep your head above water, big time.
No, I love that about delegating, and you're right. Those are some common fears around that, right? Especially for newer leaders and managers, worrying that they need to make an impact themselves, that they don't want to give away those critical tasks or responsibilities that they can shine themselves with and show that they can get that next promotion or move to the next level.
Yeah.
And then in regards to overwhelm, there's always this talk about work-life balance, right? And I've heard this from other educators and leaders stating that that's kind of a misnomer. No one has perfect balance all the time. There's periods in which you're going to focus more in your career, but you can't let that focus then be there for too long or be too concentrated in that one area because the other areas are going to suffer. So maybe for a few months, you have to ramp up a project or make sure you get that promotion, but then back off a little so you can spend more time with family, more time with your physical health and well-being. And that kind of goes in line with overwhelm, right? So that if you feel overwhelmed in one area, then maybe you're out of balance in that area. Maybe you're expending too much of your resources or your time in that area, and you need to balance it out with some other areas that are good for your physical, mental well-being, your spiritual well-being, whatever the case may be. What are your thoughts around work-life balance? And does that really contribute to this overwhelming issue that everyone's having right now? If people were more in balance, would they be less overwhelmed?
Well, I think that work-life balance or work-life integration, as some people call it, is really going to be unique for each person as to what the ideal looks like. And that's where things like setting boundaries become really important. And again, that's really going to vary by person and by situation. There's always going to be a crunch time. My accountant right now, I don't envy him. It's tax season and he's got probably hundreds of tax returns to prepare. His life, I'm sure right now is not a lot of fun, but being able to take care of yourself enough to get through those crunch periods and then to be able to recover once you get through those and sort of find your homeostasis, so to speak, kind of the new steady state that's going to work for you, because it is a marathon, not a sprint. And so being able to make sure that you get through those crunch periods and that you can sustain yourself through just the day to day in the normal course of business. But one thing I want to go back to that you said earlier about, delegation and new managers, I would say it really shows up not only with new managers, certainly with them, but also at various inflection points as you go up the organization. Another big one is sort of that senior director, VP threshold that people really need to start letting go, and then even higher. And you see it a lot with, say, startup CEOs, where they've got their hands in everything in the beginning. And as the company starts scaling, they need to hire a very competent leadership team and start letting go. So it's a challenge for a lot of people as they grow in their organizations. And it's a new challenge at each inflection point.
I would definitely agree with you. A lot of founders' issues that we see time and time again where they can't let go. And that limits the growth of that organization from growing to that next level. So very well said. As we reach the end of this episode, I always like to ask our guests if there's one piece of advice around this topic that you could impart to the audience, what would that advice be?
I would say question your limiting beliefs. First, you have to identify your limiting beliefs. So maybe start there and then really start to question and test them.
Thank you, Rebecca. And remind all of our listeners how they can reach out to you and connect with you.
Sure. You can follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter at rszucker, Zucker. And you can also go to our website at nextsteppartners.com.
Great. Thank you for a great episode today. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. I encourage our listeners to review and rate this podcast, and I'm always looking for ways to improve it to make it more relevant and applicable to you. You can also subscribe to it on Apple and Spotify. It can be accessed through our website at ims-online.com.